This mess. Now, why did we get into this mess? I gave you the history of it, but another important part is that what we call today financial markets are not markets by any stretch of the imagination, in the sense that 3/4 of what is traded in the financial market today is actually traded over the counter, and the over the counter markets are not really markets, they are the domain of roughly 10 or 12 of the most important banks in the world, and 80% of the transaction have one of those banks at the other end. So it's basically an unregulated oligopoly that we have allowed to form or has formed naturally, but to think that that is a market is very, very far from any idea of market that we might have formed through our images. On the contrary, a market like the market for equities, the stock market, or the futures market, the regulated futures market in Chicago, those are regulated markets and are operating perfectly well, while the totally unregulated markets that the banks have developed over the last 20 years have totally ceased to operate in any reasonable form. What does that tell us? It tells us that basically I was very interested by the terminal part of the conversation you had previously on the electricity market, because I have the impression that the financial market has been given for granted and has not been studied to the level of depth that the academia has been dedicating to the electricity market or other newer market, because it was thought that the financial markets are there, they are the paradigm of the perfect market, and so on and so forth. Nothing could be further from the truth. I view markets as a complex and evolving system. Basically, they are man-made ecosystem, and as such, they have failed. I mean, we have seen that leaving the big banks alone to do the markets has actually been a mistake. And I think we have to change, from the point of view of regulation, what has been the paradigm from the last basically 50 years of trying to protect intermediaries from themselves in trying to give limits to what each intermediary can do, to try to think what the overall stability of the market requires. Futures market, for instance, have gone through incredible volatility in '87 or now without ever suffering the kind of catastrophic failure that over-the-counter market have gone through in the last few months. The key interacting variables in this effort are basically the degrees of freedom and the responsibility we give to agents, and the fact that the major agents in the financial market were too big to fail, so totally deresponsibilized, certainly has a lot to do with the mess we are in. Probably a healthy market requires a good level of biodiversity among the agents. It requires certainly competition. The agents' incentives is something that is crucial, and we have learned from game theory the different kind of interaction that leads to different stabilizing or destabilizing relationship. The emerging nature of marginal return is also crucial. We have seen that if we have banks that are deemed too big to fail, they will have a cheaper access to credit, which will give them more credit availability, and they will tend to grow larger and larger and larger, and in a positive feedback loop, which always ends up in catastrophe. So we need to verify that in a market the structure of a marginal return is negative. Otherwise, sooner or later, you will have feedback loops which will go out of control. Another crucial aspect is the structure of the network, of the connection among the participants. In the over-the-counter markets, the structure is that of a hub and spoke. So you have those 12 key players, and all the other players are linked to one or the other of the hubs. That kind of network, and we are learning this in these years as people are beginning to study the internet and network theory generally, is very fragile, because if only one or two of the hubs fail, the whole system, the whole network fails in a catastrophic way, meaning that it immediately loses all functionality. on the other side, a market like, again, the regulated futures market, which is a market where you have a centralized clearinghouse and where people have to pay margin for that position, whether they are called Antonio Foglia or whether they are called Goldman Sachs. In those markets, the network structure of the relationship is more similar to that of a fisherman net, where you can have a failure of even many of the knots, and still the net doesn't lose its overall functionality. Now, all this poses a problem in the sense that the dynamic properties of a complex system like financial markets might involve trade-off between long-term efficiency and volatility, which has proven to be incompatible with the time frame that the politicians or the regulators or the banker that operate it have. Of course, these are all people that, whose job comes to a term end and they need to be re-elected to their position, and so are very interested in having a very low volatility and in pushing problems in the tail end of the distribution, at least for the time where they want to be re-elected. But this has proven to be an ineffective way because it has given us a crisis too big to manage every 70 years or so, and we are in one right now, where it would probably be better to have more frequent crises, which might send some people home, but that would be more manageable for the system as a whole. So the immediate action, as far as I'm concerned, are to bring the OTC trading back on regulated markets, and this is very easy to do. Suffice to say that under Basel II, that every derivative product, if it's traded on an exchange, it requires somewhat less capital than if it's traded over the counter, and I never understood why such a simple rule was never implemented. We need to reintroduce the material risk for banker of going broke. And we need, of course, to amend the mess of crazy procyclical regulation that has allowed also banks to carry the sort of untenable leverage that I have shown you before. I think I gave you enough for the time being.